Sir, stop calculating. The equation is doing exactly what you told it to do. The sentence came from the back row of the Harvard lecture hall, quiet but clear enough to cut through the hum of the projector. Professor Jonathan Whitmore stopped with the marker still in his hand. On the screen behind him, red simulation lines climbed apart from one another like cracks spreading through glass. For the third time in 20 minutes, the water distribution model had failed to converge. Graduate students sat behind open laptops. A few whispered about solver tolerance. Others stared at the equations filling the blackboard. Whitmore turned slowly. Who said that? 17-year-old Eli Carter raised one hand. He was a black teenager from rural Georgia, sitting beneath a temporary scholarship badge that looked too large against his faded blue shirt. His backpack rested between his worn work boots, and a thin line of red Georgia clay still showed along one sole, despite his attempt to clean it that morning. Several heads turned. Miles Bradford, a white graduate student near the aisle, looked back at Eli with the same expression he had used earlier when asking whether Eli was delivering equipment. Whitmore studied him. You believe the equation is correct? Eli swallowed. The room suddenly felt colder than it had a second earlier. He could hear the ventilation system above him and the faint clicking of someone typing near the front. Yes, sir. Whitmore glanced toward the screen. Then why does the model diverge? Eli looked at the red curves again. He had been watching them for nearly half an hour. The shape bothered him more than the numbers. Pressure rose too smoothly at the upstream boundary, then separated from the field values farther down the network. He had seen curves like that before, only not beneath Harvard lights. He had seen them before sunrise with mud on his knees and a wrench in his hand. Because the mistake happened before the first number, Eli said. A few students shifted. Whitmore lowered the marker. That is a dramatic statement. Eli did not answer. What mistake? Whitmore asked. Eli pointed toward the projected assumptions listed beside the model. The upstream pressure boundary is fixed. Of course it is. Why? Whitmore blinked. Because the source pressure is treated as controlled. Eli looked toward the graph. Treated as controlled is not the same as controlled. Miles gave a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Whitmore heard it too. Mister, he looked at Eli's badge. Carter. This model was built from calibrated field data gathered across multiple agricultural systems. Yes, sir. And reviewed by people who work on these systems professionally. Yes, sir. Whitmore waited. Eli could feel every eye on him now. His palm had gone damp against the edge of the seat. He thought of his father saying that truth did not become less true because the room was expensive. Eli looked back at the screen. Then somebody should check the boundary against the raw sensor history. Whitmore's expression changed slightly. Not respect. Curiosity, maybe irritation. You think our calibration is wrong? I think the model is trusting something that the field probably was not. The room went quiet again. Whitmore placed the marker on the tray. You have seen this dataset before? Eli hesitated. Not all of it. Then how would you know? Eli looked at the pressure curve, then at the metadata label in the lower corner of the screen. One station number had been bothering him since the first run. 12. He stood. Because I have seen what that kind of error looks like when the pipe is in the ground instead of on a slide. Miles turned fully in his chair now. Whitmore stepped away from the board and gestured toward the aisle. Then come down here and show me. 3 days earlier, at 5:38 in the morning, Eli Carter was standing ankle-deep in Georgia mud with a flashlight between his teeth and one hand wrapped around a cold metal valve. Dawn had not reached the fields yet. The irrigation lines disappeared into darkness, and a thin layer of mist hovered above the rows of winter cover crop like breath trapped close to the ground. His father, Daniel Carter, stood 10 feet away beside the control box, wearing a faded work jacket, a knit cap, and boots that had long ago stopped pretending they could stay clean. Computer says we are fine, Daniel called. Eli removed the flashlight from his mouth and looked at the pressure reading on the digital display. The pipe disagrees. Daniel glanced toward the manual gauge mounted lower on the line. How much? Eli crouched beside it. Almost 3 inches too high on the sensor reading. That enough to worry about? Enough to check. He wiped condensation from the glass with his sleeve and compared the numbers again. Sensor 12 had been drifting slightly for 2 mornings, never enough to trigger a full alarm, but enough to bother him. Eli had learned to distrust numbers that became cleaner than the machines producing them. A pump coughed somewhere farther down the line, then settled into a steady hum. Daniel stepped closer. Could be temperature. Maybe. Could be the gauge. Maybe. Could be you looking for trouble before breakfast. Eli looked up. Also maybe. Daniel smiled. Good. At least Harvard has not ruined you yet. Eli shook his head and opened the weathered notebook he carried in the side pocket of his jacket. The pages smelled faintly of damp paper and machine oil. He wrote the time, outside temperature, manual pressure, sensor pressure, and one short note. Possible winter calibration drift. Daniel leaned over his shoulder. You write like somebody is going to grade the farm. Somebody should. That somebody better fix the south pump while they are here. Eli closed the notebook. Beyond them, the Carter family farm stretched across 87 acres of peanuts, soybeans, vegetables, irrigation pipe, repaired fencing, and equipment that worked because someone kept noticing when it did not. Eli had grown up measuring things before he knew the formal names for what he was measuring. Flow rate came before calculus. Pressure loss came before differential equations. He learned that a pipe could disagree with a screen, that soil could hold more information than a spreadsheet, and that the most expensive system on a farm could still be wrong if the sensor feeding it was wrong first. Daniel opened the control box and checked a connection. You packed. Mostly. Mostly means no. I packed clothes. Notebook. Eli held it up. Laptop. Charging. Shoes without mud. Eli looked down at his boots. Red Georgia clay filled the seams around the soles. Working on that. Daniel laughed softly. Harvard might survive. Eli looked across the dark field. In less than 24 hours, he would be on a plane for the Rural Scholarship Program in Cambridge, sitting in rooms built for students who had taken courses his high school did not even offer. He had not told Daniel how nervous that made him. Daniel had not asked. Instead, his father pointed toward sensor 12. You want me to replace it while you are gone? Eli considered the reading once more. No. Leave it in. Why? I want another day of data. Daniel nodded as if the answer made complete sense. With him, it usually did. Eli tightened the housing, wiped the mud from his hands, and looked at the manual gauge one final time. The needle stayed steady. The digital display still read high. He opened the notebook again and underlined the last word twice. Drift. By the time Eli reached Cambridge, most of the red Georgia clay was gone from his boots, but not all of it. A thin rust-colored line still clung to the stitching near the heel, too deep for the hotel washcloth he had used the night before. He noticed it while standing outside the Harvard Mathematics building with his backpack over one shoulder and a temporary scholarship badge clipped to his faded blue shirt. Students crossed the courtyard carrying laptops and coffee cups, moving with the confidence of people who already knew which doors belonged to them. Eli checked the building number twice, even though he knew it was correct. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old wood, printer paper, and burnt coffee. A young white man in a Harvard sweatshirt was arranging cables beside a rolling equipment case near the lecture room. He looked at Eli, then at the backpack, then at the boots. Delivery goes through the service entrance, he said. Eli stopped. I am not delivering anything. The man glanced at the badge. Oh. He stepped closer and read it. Rural Scholarship Program. Yes, sir. I am Miles Bradford. He gave a quick smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Graduate assistant. Eli nodded. Eli Carter. Miles looked toward the lecture room. You are early. I usually am. From where? Georgia. Farm country. Eli adjusted the strap on his shoulder. Yes. Miles smiled again. Well, this should be interesting. He turned back to the cables before Eli could decide what that meant. The introductory seminar began 20 minutes later. Professor Jonathan Whitmore entered without notes, carrying only a black marker and a paper cup of coffee. He was 54, white, silver beginning at his temples, dressed in a dark jacket over an open-collar shirt. The room settled almost instantly. Whitmore spoke about applied mathematics as if it were less a subject than a language everyone serious should already understand. Optimization, nonlinear systems, numerical stability, model uncertainty. Eli followed easily until Whitmore began asking students about their academic backgrounds, private academies, advanced placement courses, dual enrollment, university summer programs. When Whitmore reached Eli, he glanced down at the temporary badge. Mr. Carter. Advanced calculus. Yes, sir. Whitmore looked mildly surprised. Your school offers it. No, sir. A brief pause. Then where did you take it? I did not take it at school. Whitmore's expression changed before Eli finished the sentence. Differential equations? Yes, sir. Also not at school. No, sir. Whitmore gave a small nod and moved on. All right. Eli watched him turn toward the next student. The unfinished part of the conversation stayed in the air. Whitmore had asked what the school offered, not what Eli had learned. Nobody asked about the old calculus textbook Daniel bought from a closing library sale, or the online lectures Eli watched after fixing irrigation lines, or the numerical methods code he ran on a laptop with a cracked corner. Nobody asked why he had taught himself pressure flow equations in the first place. During the break, Eli stood near the window with a paper cup of water. Miles approached. Do not take Whitmore personally. Eli looked at him. I did not. He just likes people to have the foundation. So do I. Miles smiled. You know what I mean. Eli looked across the room toward Whitmore, who was discussing a simulation with two graduate students using language he had never once simplified for them. Daniel's voice came back quietly from home. Do not prove you belong. Prove what is true. Eli set the empty cup down. Across the hall, technicians were preparing the afternoon water system demonstration. On one monitor, a network map appeared for half a second before the screen changed. Eli stopped walking. Something about the pressure layout looked familiar. The afternoon demonstration filled the largest lecture room in the building, and by the time Eli found a seat near the back, every screen at the front was glowing with maps, equations, and pressure curves. The model represented water distribution across several rural agricultural networks under drought conditions, combining elevation, demand, pump behavior, storage capacity, and sensor data into one system. Professor Whitmore stood beside the projection screen while Miles and two other graduate students worked at laptops below him. Dr. Rebecca Lawson sat near the center aisle with a tablet on her lap, watching the simulation setup more closely than the audience. Eli noticed the network map again. This time he could study it. One branch curved through a layout that felt almost familiar, though the labels had been replaced by numerical identifiers. Whitmore began the run. For several seconds, the graph behaved. Then one red line climbed too quickly, another dropped, and the solver warning appeared near the bottom of the screen. The room shifted. Miles leaned toward his laptop. Tolerance issue, he said. Whitmore nodded. Reduce the step size. Miles changed the setting. They ran it again. The same divergence returned, only later. Whitmore frowned. Try the alternate solver. Another graduate student adjusted the configuration. Third run. Same pattern. The projector fan hummed above the silence. Eli looked at the curve, not the warning message. Upstream pressure stayed unnaturally steady before the model lost stability farther down the network. It was too clean. Real systems did not behave that politely when demand changed across elevation. He opened his notebook and drew the shape from memory. Fixed boundary. Variable field. Pressure mismatch. Whitmore ran the model a fourth time, this time changing the initial conditions. The red lines separated again. There is something we are missing, he said. Rebecca looked toward the raw output. The numerical method may not be the source. Whitmore shook his head. The equations are sound. Eli looked at the assumptions listed beside the map. The upstream pressure value was fixed across the run. He felt the same irritation he had felt standing beside sensor 12 before sunrise. A screen reporting certainty where the hardware had only offered approximation. Miles spoke quietly to Whitmore. Could be one of the interpolation steps. The pre-processing was validated, Whitmore said. Eli raised his hand halfway, then lowered it. His father's voice came back again. Prove what is true. The fifth run failed. Eli raised his hand fully. Whitmore did not see him at first. Rebecca did. She glanced back, then followed his gaze toward the pressure curve. Professor, she said, I think the scholarship student has a question. Whitmore turned. Mr. Carter? Eli stood. The upstream boundary is fixed. Whitmore looked at the screen. Yes. Why? A few graduate students exchanged glances. Whitmore answered patiently, but the patience sounded practiced. Because the source pressure is controlled. Controlled in the model, Eli said. Controlled in the system. Did the field sensor confirm that for the full run? Miles looked over his shoulder. Whitmore's expression tightened. This is not a farm irrigation problem, Mr. Carter. The sentence landed harder than Eli expected. He looked down at his boots for half a second, at the line of Georgia clay still caught in the stitching, then back at the screen. That may be why nobody has fixed it yet. The room went still. Miles stopped typing. Rebecca lowered her tablet. Whitmore stared at Eli. Explain. Eli pointed toward the pressure trace. If the upstream sensor drifted high, pre-processing could make the source look more stable than it was. Then the solver is not failing. It is trying to satisfy a boundary condition the field never actually had. Whitmore's eyes moved toward the graph. You are making an assumption about the sensor. Yes, sir. Based on what? Eli swallowed. The shape. Whitmore gave a short, skeptical breath. The shape. And one station number. That changed Rebecca's expression. Which station? She asked. Eli looked at the lower corner of the map. 12. Miles turned back to the metadata window. Whitmore watched Eli for another second, then gestured toward the front. Come down here. Eli stepped into the aisle. Every head followed him as he walked toward the board, the soft scrape of his work boots against the polished floor suddenly louder than the projector. Eli reached the front of the lecture room and stopped beside the projection screen. Up close, the equations looked less intimidating than the silence behind him. Professor Whitmore handed him the marker without smiling. You said the boundary condition is wrong. Eli nodded. I said it might be. Then show us. Eli turned toward the board. His hand felt cold around the marker. He drew a short line representing the upstream section, then marked the elevation change and the first pressure station. If the source pressure is treated as fixed, every downstream correction depends on this value being trustworthy. Whitmore crossed his arms. That is basic modeling. Yes, sir. Eli added a second mark. But if this sensor reads high, the solver keeps trying to satisfy a pressure condition the real system never had. Miles leaned toward his laptop. We calibrate before the data enters the model. Eli looked at him. Against what? Field records. Raw records. Miles paused. Processed field records. Rebecca Lawson looked up from her tablet. That is not the same thing. Whitmore glanced toward her, then back to Eli. Continue. Eli drew two pressure curves. One smooth, one slightly uneven. Real irrigation systems move when temperature changes. Pumps cycle. Valves lag. Demand shifts. If pre-processing smooths all of that into one clean upstream value, the model can look more certain than the field ever was. Whitmore stepped closer to the board. You are describing noise. Eli shook his head. Sometimes noise is noise. He pointed to the uneven curve. Sometimes it is a warning. A few students shifted in their seats. Miles opened the metadata panel and began scrolling through station records. Eli watched the list move. 11, 12, 13. Stop. Miles stopped. Station 12. Yes. Whitmore looked at Eli. Why that one? Eli moved closer to the screen. The station identifier was abbreviated, but the network coordinates appeared underneath it. His stomach tightened. He knew those numbers. He had copied them into a notebook beside a muddy irrigation trench the year before. Open the source location, he said. Miles hesitated, then clicked. A new line appeared beneath the sensor ID. Carter Family Cooperative, Georgia. The room went quiet. Rebecca leaned forward. Whitmore looked from the screen to Eli. Carter. Eli nodded. My family. Miles turned in his chair. This dataset came from your farm? Part of it. Whitmore's expression changed, but only slightly. That still does not prove the sensor drifted. No, sir. Eli stepped toward the screen. But the winter log might. Rebecca asked, what happened to Station 12? Eli could almost feel the cold metal housing again. Early morning mist. Daniel's flashlight. The manual gauge sitting lower than the digital reading. It was reading high in cold weather. How high? Miles asked. About 3 inches above the manual gauge the morning before I left. Whitmore stared at him. You remember that exactly? Eli looked at the station number. I wrote it down. Rebecca said, who serviced the sensor? Eli answered before he had time to think about how strange the truth would sound in this room. I did. Whitmore's eyebrows lifted. You serviced a research sensor? It was part of our irrigation network before it was part of your data set. Miles stopped typing. Rebecca looked at the metadata again, then at Eli's work boots, then back at the screen. Whitmore asked the question slowly. How do you know where sensor 12 was installed? Eli held his gaze. Because I buried it. For several seconds, nobody in the lecture room spoke. The words seemed to hang above the laptops and polished desks longer than Eli expected. Whitmore looked back at the metadata, then at the simulation curve, then at Eli. Rebecca Lawson was the first to move. She stood and walked toward Miles's laptop. Open the pre-processing history. Miles clicked through 2 folders. We only have the cleaned package in this workspace. Then open the processing notes. He found them. A list of automated corrections appeared on the screen. Missing values, interpolation, outlier removal, smoothing thresholds. Rebecca leaned closer. There. She pointed to one line. Station 12. Winter anomaly flagged. Interpolated across adjacent intervals. Eli felt something tighten in his chest. You removed it. Miles turned slightly. We corrected an outlier. Did you check why it was an outlier? That is what the cleaning protocol is for. Eli shook his head. Cleaning does not explain it. Whitmore stepped closer. Mr. Carter, large field datasets require pre-processing. We cannot build a model around every irregular reading. Eli looked at the graph. I am not saying build around every irregular reading. He pointed toward the station history. I am saying this one was not random. Rebecca scrolled farther. The flag appears more than once. Miles frowned. Only during a cold weather period. Eli nodded. Exactly. Whitmore looked at him. And you believe that means the upstream boundary was variable. I believe it means you should stop treating the sensor as proof that it was fixed. Rebecca opened another panel. If the calibration drift affected the source estimate, then the interpolation may have made the boundary look more stable than it actually was. Miles stared at the screen. So the clean data could be reinforcing the assumption. Yes, Rebecca said. Eli looked at Whitmore. You cleaned away the warning. A low murmur moved through the graduate students. Whitmore's expression hardened. That is an overstatement. Eli met his eyes. Then check the raw log. One sensor from one farm does not invalidate the model. No, sir. Eli pointed toward the fixed boundary term. The assumption does, if it came from the wrong reading. Whitmore looked toward the audience, suddenly aware that the demonstration had become something else. This system includes data from multiple networks, multiple calibration procedures, and months of validation. We are not going to rebuild the model because a scholarship student recognizes one station from home. The word scholarship landed differently than it had that morning. Eli felt it. So did Rebecca. She looked at Whitmore, but he continued. You have provided useful context. Thank you. Melissa can take you back to the scholarship session. Eli stood still for half a second. The marker in his hand felt heavier now. He placed it carefully on the tray. Yes, sir. Miles looked down at his keyboard. Rebecca did not. As Eli walked toward the aisle, he heard Whitmore say, Let us return to the model. Eli reached the door, then stopped. The red Georgia clay along his boot had left a faint mark on the polished floor. He turned back. Professor. Whitmore looked up. If you run it again, use the original winter calibration log, not the cleaned file. Whitmore did not answer. Eli opened the door. Rebecca watched him leave, then looked at the frozen simulation screen. Station 12 was still highlighted. She reached for her laptop. Miles, she said quietly, find me the raw archive. Eli sat alone on a wooden bench outside the scholarship office with his backpack between his feet and his temporary badge turned backward against his shirt. Through the closed door at the far end of the hallway, he could still hear the faint hum of the lecture hall ventilation system. He pulled out his phone and called Daniel. His father answered on the 4th ring. You break Harvard yet? Eli looked down at the polished floor. Not exactly. That sounds worse. Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees. They have data from our farm in a water model. Which data? Irrigation network. Sensor 12. Daniel became quiet. The one you checked before you left? Yes. And they cleaned the winter anomaly out. Daniel let out a slow breath. So the computer decided the computer was right. Eli almost smiled. Something like that. You tell them? I tried. Tried means what? Eli looked toward the lecture hall door. Professor sent me back to the scholarship session. Daniel was silent for a moment. Eli could hear wind on the other end, then the distant engine of a tractor. You know what that pipe did this morning? Daniel asked. What? Same thing. Sensor still reading high. Eli sat straighter. How much? About the same. Manual gauge lower. Did you write it down? I have been living with you too long. Yes. Eli closed his eyes briefly. Can you send me a picture of the log? Already taking one. Daniel paused. Son. Yes. Do not confuse somebody not listening with you being wrong. Eli looked at the dark screen of his phone after the call ended. A few seconds later, the photo arrived. Date. Temperature. Manual pressure. Sensor pressure. Same drift. He saved it. Inside the lecture hall, Rebecca Lawson was standing behind Miles while he searched the archived storage server. There, he said. Raw winter package. He opened the original logs. The clean dataset appeared beside them. Rebecca compared the columns line by line. Station 12 showed the same pattern Eli had described, a cold weather drift, repeated enough to suggest calibration trouble, then smoothed into a stable line during pre-processing. That is not noise, she said. Miles frowned. It looked like noise statistically, because the protocol did not know the field context. Whitmore stood several feet away, watching without speaking. Rebecca rebuilt the source boundary using the raw calibration history and replaced the fixed upstream pressure assumption with a field-informed range. Run it. Miles started the simulation. The red curves moved across the screen. No divergence. Nobody spoke. Again, Rebecca said. Second run. Stable. Third run. Stable. Whitmore stepped closer. Changed the initial condition. Miles did. Fourth run. Stable. Rebecca changed the tolerance. Fifth run. Stable. Then 6, 7, 8, 9. On the 10th run, the final residual dropped below the convergence threshold and stayed there. Miles leaned back from the laptop. He was right. Rebecca looked at the screen. About more than the sensor. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? She opened the scholarship database and searched for Carter, Eli. One file appeared. Technical submission. Uploaded 3 months earlier. Rebecca opened it and scrolled. Page 7. Page 11. Page 14. She stopped. There, in Eli's own diagrams and equations, was a correction for variable source pressure under field sensor drift, almost the same adjustment that had just stabilized the Harvard model. Miles stared. He submitted this before he came here? Rebecca nodded. Whitmore stepped closer. At the bottom of the evaluation page sat a summary score and a faculty approval line. His own name was there. Jonathan Whitmore. Rebecca looked at him. You had the answer 3 months ago. Whitmore did not answer. Rebecca scrolled back to the evaluation page and opened the reviewer comments. The technical submission had not failed. That was what made the silence worse. Eli's model had scored high for originality, strong for mathematical reasoning, and unusually high for field relevance. The lower marks came from somewhere else. Institutional exposure, advanced mentorship, academic readiness. One comment read, strong practical instincts, but limited evidence of preparation for elite theoretical work. Miles read it twice. Who wrote that? Rebecca opened the reviewer history. The summary was compiled by the scholarship committee. Whitmore stepped closer. And the final ranking? Rebecca clicked once. Eli Carter, 74. Below several applicants whose technical submissions were weaker, but whose schools, summer programs, and recommendation letters came from places the committee recognized immediately. Whitmore looked at the approval line again. His own name remained at the bottom. I did not score the technical section, he said. Rebecca turned toward him. No, I approved the final list. Yes. The projector screen behind them still showed the stable simulation. 10 successful runs. On the laptop beside it, page 14 of Eli's submission showed almost the same correction. Miles sat very still. Earlier that morning, he had mistaken Eli for a delivery worker. Now the memory felt embarrassingly loud. He wrote this without university supervision? Miles asked. Rebecca looked at the application notes. His listed mentor is his high school physics teacher for general academic support. She scrolled farther. The water modeling work appears self-directed. Whitmore picked up the printed summary sheet from the desk. Limited evidence of preparation, he read quietly. Rebecca said nothing. He looked at the mathematical submission again. The equations were not polished the way Harvard graduate work was polished. The formatting was uneven. Some graphs had been exported from simple software. One diagram looked hand-labeled, but the reasoning was there. More than that, the correction that had just saved their demonstration was there. 3 months earlier, waiting beneath a score that had told everyone Eli was not ready. Whitmore lowered the paper. Where is he? Rebecca glanced toward the door. Scholarship wing. Miles stood. I can get him. No, Whitmore said. Miles stopped. Whitmore looked at the approval line one more time. I will. In the hallway, Eli was still sitting on the wooden bench with Daniel's photograph open on his phone. The image showed the morning log from Georgia, the manual reading lower than Sensor 12 again. A group of scholarship students passed, talking about dinner plans and campus tours. Eli turned the temporary badge over between his fingers. He had expected satisfaction if Harvard confirmed he was right. Instead, he felt hollow. Being correct had not changed the moment when Whitmore sent him out of the room. It had not changed the way Miles looked at his boots. It had not changed the fact that the model trusted his family's data more easily than the people who understood where that data came from. The lecture hall door opened at the far end of the corridor. Whitmore stepped out alone. Eli looked up. The professor walked toward him slowly, holding several printed pages. He stopped a few feet away. "Mr. Carter." Eli stood. "Yes, sir." Whitmore held out the pages. Eli recognized his own submission before he saw the title. Page 14 was on top. "Your correction worked," Whitmore said. Eli looked at the paper, then at him. "How many times?" Whitmore paused. 10 runs. Eli nodded once. No smile. Whitmore noticed. "You submitted this method 3 months ago." "Yes, sir." "I did not know." Eli looked at the faculty approval printed at the bottom of the evaluation sheet in Whitmore's hand. "Your name did." Whitmore looked at the approval line as if the printed name belonged to someone else. "I approve the ranking," he said. Eli kept his eyes on him. "I know." The hallway lights hummed above them. Somewhere behind a closed door, someone laughed. Then the sound disappeared. Whitmore shifted the papers in his hand. "I relied on the committee summary." Eli glanced at page 14. "You relied on people who relied on a summary." Whitmore did not answer. Eli's voice stayed quiet. And everybody decided that was enough. The professor looked toward the floor for a moment. The technical section was stronger than the final score reflected. "That is what the page says." I should have read the full submission. "Yes, sir." The answer was so simple that Whitmore almost flinched. Eli turned the scholarship badge over between his fingers again. "You know what bothered me most?" Whitmore waited. "It was not that you thought I might be wrong about the model. You should check that." Eli looked toward the lecture hall. "It was how fast you decided what kind of wrong I was allowed to be." Whitmore's expression tightened. "I'm not sure I understand." Eli looked directly at him. "You heard public school, farm, temporary badge. Then you talked to me like I had wandered into the room by accident." Whitmore opened his mouth, but Eli continued. "Miles thought I was delivering equipment before he read my badge. You asked whether my school offered calculus, but when I said no, you never asked where I learned it. You heard what I did not have before you asked what I knew." Whitmore stood very still. Eli looked down at the red clay still caught in the stitching of his boot. "I think you saw a black farm kid with a temporary badge and decided how much explaining I would need before I had said 10 words." The hallway felt colder after that sentence. Whitmore looked at Eli for a long time. "That was not my intention." Eli nodded. "I know. Then you think I am prejudiced." Eli considered the question. "I think you made an assumption." Whitmore's eyes moved toward the papers in his hand. "About your preparation. About me." The distinction landed. Eli continued. "The model had the same problem." Whitmore looked up. "What do you mean?" "You treated the source pressure like it was fixed because the clean data made it look fixed." Eli pointed toward the scholarship evaluation. "Then you treated school access like it was ability because the application made it look measurable." Whitmore stared at him. Eli's voice did not rise. "The equation was not your first bad assumption." For several seconds, Whitmore said nothing. The same man who had filled an auditorium with explanations now seemed unable to find one. Finally, he looked at the approval line again. "You are right." Eli did not smile. Whitmore folded the papers carefully. "I did not read your work closely enough. I saw the summary, the institutional background, the absence of advanced coursework, and I accepted a conclusion that should have required more scrutiny." Eli listened. "That is on me." The words were plain. No defense. No qualification. Eli looked toward the lecture hall door. "What happens now?" Whitmore followed his gaze. "First, I correct the model record." "And the scholarship?" Whitmore hesitated. "I am asking the committee to reopen the evaluation." Eli looked back at him. "Using what?" "The technical work. Not the school name. Not the school name. Not the summer programs I did not have." "No," Eli nodded once. Whitmore took a breath. "Will you come back inside?" Eli looked at the closed lecture hall door, then at page 14, still visible beneath Whitmore's hand. "For the math." Whitmore met his eyes. "For what we failed to see." Whitmore did not lead Eli back to the lecture hall immediately. Instead, he turned toward a glass conference room across the corridor and opened the door. "There is one more thing you should hear before we go back in." Eli followed, leaving his backpack near the chair closest to the wall. Inside, Rebecca Lawson was already there with Miles and 2 members of the scholarship committee connected by video. The stable simulation remained open on Rebecca's laptop. 10 successful runs lined across the screen. Whitmore placed Eli's application on the table. "I need to correct the record," he said. One of the committee members adjusted her glasses. "About the technical submission? About the ranking process?" Eli stayed standing. Whitmore looked at him before continuing. "I did not personally score the mathematical model." Eli's expression did not change. "Is that supposed to make it better?" The room became still. Whitmore shook his head. "No," he looked back toward the screen. "I approved the final recommendation based on the committee summary. That summary weighed formal coursework, institutional exposure, recommendation access, and prior mentorship heavily." Rebecca folded her arms. "All things unevenly distributed before the student ever applies." Whitmore nodded. "Yes." Miles looked down at the table. Eli opened his notebook and turned to the page where he had copied pressure readings from home. The paper was creased at the corners, stained faintly near the edge from field use. "What did those categories tell you about this?" he asked. Nobody answered. He tapped the notebook once. "What did they tell you about sensor drift? Or whether I could model it? Or whether I knew why a fixed boundary could fail?" One committee member said carefully, "They were intended to estimate readiness." Eli looked at her. "Readiness for what?" "Advanced research." "Then why was the research worth less than the things around it?" The question sat there. Whitmore pulled out a chair, but did not sit. "That is the problem." He looked toward Rebecca. "I want the submissions reevaluated using technical originality, mathematical reasoning, evidence of independent work, and clarity of assumptions. Remove school prestige, access to advanced programs, and mentorship pedigree as scoring advantages." The committee member frowned. "That changes the rubric during the cycle." "Then the rubric should have been questioned before the cycle." Whitmore's voice remained calm. "We are not lowering the standard. We are removing proxies that were treated like standards." Rebecca nodded once. Miles finally looked up. "What happens to the students who had those opportunities?" "Their work is still judged," Whitmore said. "Their access simply stops counting as proof that they are more capable." Eli listened carefully. This was the first time since arriving at Harvard that the room seemed to be discussing the system instead of explaining it to him. The committee agreed to reopen the technical review, not because Eli had embarrassed anyone, because the existing scoring process had failed to measure what it claimed to measure. Whitmore gathered the papers and turned toward him. "I would still like you to come back to the lecture hall." Eli looked through the glass wall toward the corridor beyond. "To show the correction?" "Yes." "Only the correction?" Whitmore paused. Rebecca watched him. "No," he said. "I want them to see the reasoning that led you there." Eli closed his notebook. "Then I want the field contributors named." Whitmore looked at him. "Named where?" "In the model documentation. The people who collected the data. The technicians. Farmers. My father. If the research trusts what they measured, their names should not disappear when the data gets clean enough for Harvard." Rebecca's expression softened. Miles looked back at the simulation. Whitmore nodded slowly. "That is fair." Eli picked up his backpack. "Then I will come back." Whitmore reached for the door, but Eli did not move yet. "Professor." Whitmore turned. Eli looked at the application file on the table. "Next time, do not wait for somebody to fix your model before you decide their work is worth reading." Whitmore held his gaze. "I will not." Eli stepped into the hallway. This time, when they walked toward the lecture hall, Whitmore did not go ahead of him. When Eli and Whitmore stepped back into the lecture hall, the room looked almost exactly as they had left it, but the silence had changed. The simulation still glowed on the main screen. 10 successful runs remained stacked along the right side, each one ending below the convergence threshold. Rebecca stood near the front with Miles beside her, and several graduate students had turned their chairs toward the aisle. Whitmore walked to the lectern, then stopped before reaching it. "We need to correct more than the model," he said. No one moved. He looked toward Eli. "Mr. Carter, would you show them what we missed?" Eli adjusted the strap of his backpack and walked to the board. This time nobody laughed at the work boots. Nobody looked at the temporary badge first. He picked up the marker and drew the same upstream boundary he had drawn earlier, but slower now. The solver was not the problem, he said. The model was obeying the assumptions. He pointed to the fixed pressure term. This value came from a sensor history that had been cleaned. The winter anomaly was treated like noise, but the raw field log showed repeated calibration drift during cold conditions. Rebecca advanced the slide. The clean data appeared beside the original winter log. The difference was obvious now. When that warning disappeared, Eli continued. The source looked more stable than it really was. Miles opened the corrected run. We replaced the fixed boundary with a field-informed range, he said. 10 runs. 10 converged. Eli looked at him. Miles nodded once. Not an apology exactly, but close enough to be honest. Whitmore stepped forward. The correction was not developed here today. He held up Eli's scholarship submission. It appeared in Mr. Carter's technical work 3 months ago, and I approved a ranking process that failed to recognize what was already there. A murmur moved through the room. Eli looked down at the marker in his hand. Whitmore continued. That is my responsibility. Then Rebecca changed the slide again. A new heading appeared. Field Data Contributors. Eli's chest tightened. The first name on the list was Daniel Carter. Below it were county technicians, neighboring farmers, irrigation workers, and several people who had recorded manual pressure readings across the network. Eli stared at the screen longer than he meant to. The auditorium blurred slightly at the edges. Whitmore noticed. You asked that the people behind the data be named. Eli nodded. They should be. He turned toward the audience. A dataset looks clean when it gets here, but somebody had to stand in the mud and write those numbers down. Somebody had to know when a gauge sounded wrong, when a pump felt different, when a sensor was acting strange because the temperature dropped overnight. He pointed toward his father's name. If the model trusts the measurement, it should not forget the person who made it. The room stayed quiet. Rebecca looked at Eli with a small smile. Miles glanced toward the contributor list, then lowered his eyes. Whitmore stepped away from the lectern completely, leaving Eli alone at the front. Anything else? He asked. Eli looked back at the equation. Yes, sir. He drew a box around the word assumption. The mistake was not that the model used mathematics. He paused. The mistake was believing the cleanest number had to be the truest one. Nobody clapped right away. Eli was glad. He looked again at Daniel Carter on the screen and smiled, barely. For the first time since arriving at Harvard, the people who had made the knowledge possible were visible in the same room as the people who analyzed it. 3 days later, Eli was called back to the same conference room where the scholarship committee had reopened his file. This time, the glass walls did not make him feel like he was being examined. Rebecca sat near one end of the table with a folder open in front of her. Whitmore stood beside the window, hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. Miles was not there. Neither were the graduate students. Only Eli, Rebecca, Whitmore, and 2 scholarship committee members. Eli set his backpack beside his boots and waited. One committee member slid a printed evaluation across the table. We completed the technical review using the revised criteria. Eli looked down. Mathematical rigor, technical originality, independent reasoning, model validation, assumption clarity. The categories looked different from the first evaluation. No school prestige. No advanced program access. No institutional exposure. He read the scores slowly. First in technical originality. Near the top in mathematical rigor. Strongest rating in field model integration. At the bottom was a new recommendation. Fully funded 8-week summer research fellowship. Eli read it twice. Is this because of what happened with the model? He asked. Rebecca answered first. No. What happened with the model made us look again. The fellowship is based on the work that was already in your submission. Eli looked toward Whitmore. So the work did not get better. Whitmore shook his head. Our measurement did. The room stayed quiet. That answer mattered more to Eli than he expected. He looked down at the page again. 8 weeks in Cambridge. Housing covered. Travel covered. Research stipend included. Access to the water systems lab. A year earlier, the numbers would have sounded impossible. Now they looked strangely practical. Bus routes. Work schedule. Who would help Daniel with irrigation while he was gone? I have one condition, Eli said. One committee member smiled carefully. You have had several. Eli ignored the joke. The contributor names stay attached to the field data. Not just in the presentation. In the documentation. Rebecca nodded immediately. Agreed. Whitmore said, they stay. Eli folded the evaluation sheet and placed it inside his notebook. The meeting ended without applause. Eli preferred it that way. In the hallway, Whitmore walked beside him toward the stairs. For several steps, neither of them spoke. Then Whitmore said, Mr. Carter. Eli looked over. Yes, sir. If you were in my position the next time a student arrives without the usual background, what would you do differently? Eli stopped near a tall window overlooking the courtyard. Students crossed below carrying backpacks, coffee cups, and folders. Ask what they know before deciding what they do not. Whitmore nodded slowly. That's simple. Simple is not the same as easy. Whitmore almost smiled. No, it is not. Eli continued toward the stairs. Outside, the air was cold enough to sting his face. He called Daniel before reaching the sidewalk. His father answered over the sound of wind and machinery. Well, they offered me the summer fellowship. Silence. Then Daniel said, Paid? Eli smiled. Yes. Housing? Yes. Travel? Yes. Then Harvard finally learned something useful. Eli laughed. I guess. Daniel's voice softened. I am proud of you. Eli looked down at his boots. The red Georgia clay was still caught deep in the stitching. Thanks, Dad. Do not get comfortable. Why? South pump is leaking again. Eli laughed harder this time. I am in Massachusetts. Pipes do not care. Eli looked back at the Harvard building, all stone, glass, polished floors, and clean equations. Then he looked at the dirt caught in his boots. I know. Daniel said, Good. Come home and prove it. The call ended. Eli slipped the phone into his pocket and kept walking, the fellowship letter folded inside the same notebook that still carried Sensor 12's first winter drift reading. The following March, Eli returned to Harvard wearing the same faded blue shirt style he had worn the first time, though the sleeves fit a little differently now and his backpack carried a new research notebook inside. The red Georgia clay was gone from his boots after months of winter sidewalks, but the stitching still held faint stains that never completely disappeared. He entered the seminar room early and chose a seat near the middle instead of the back. Rebecca Lawson was already there, speaking quietly with two graduate researchers. Miles Bradford stood near the projection screen connecting a laptop, and when he saw Eli, he gave a small nod. Good to see you. Eli nodded back. You too. Nothing more was needed. The summer fellowship had changed things without making them simple. Eli had spent 8 weeks learning numerical methods from people who knew far more than he did, arguing over assumptions, breaking code, fixing it, and discovering how often good research began with admitting uncertainty. He had also gone home afterward and replaced the south pump with Daniel before school started again. Harvard had taught him some things. The farm had kept teaching him others. The room filled slowly with faculty, students, and several rural scholarship finalists visiting for the spring program. One boy, maybe 16, sat 2 rows ahead of Eli with a temporary badge clipped crookedly to his sweater. He kept looking at the board, then at the people around him, as if checking whether he belonged there. Eli recognized the habit. Professor Whitmore entered carrying a marker and no notes. He looked older than Eli remembered, though maybe only because Eli noticed different things now. Whitmore drew a new network model across the blackboard: reservoirs, elevation changes, variable demand, uncertain sensor inputs. He explained the setup, then stopped before writing the governing assumption. A year earlier, he would have finished the derivation himself. This time, he turned toward the room. Who sees something I do not? Silence. Eli felt his hand rise almost automatically. Across the aisle, the younger scholarship finalist lifted his hand too, then lowered it the moment he noticed Eli. Whitmore saw both. Mr. Carter? Eli looked at the boy. You first. The boy froze. Me? You raised your hand. A few people turned toward him. His face tightened. Eli recognized that too. Whitmore did not rush him. What do you see? The boy stood slowly and pointed toward the demand term. You are treating the downstream draw like it changes independently. Whitmore looked at the board. And you think it does not? Not if the storage tank is responding on the same time scale. The room became quiet in the good way. Whitmore stepped aside. Show me. The boy walked to the board. His first line was hesitant. The second was clearer. By the third, he had stopped looking at the audience. Eli lowered his hand and watched. Rebecca smiled slightly from the side of the room. Miles stopped typing. Whitmore asked questions, but did not interrupt the reasoning. When the boy finished, there was still a gap in the model. Eli raised his hand again. There is another assumption. Whitmore looked at him. Go ahead. Eli walked to the board and added one small boundary note beside the younger student's work. They stood there together, not competing, just building something neither had finished alone. Whitmore looked at both of them, then at the room. Sometimes the smartest person here is the one nobody remembered to ask. He capped the marker and stepped back. After the seminar, Eli packed his notebook slowly. The younger finalist stopped beside him. How did you know I had something? Eli zipped the bag. You raised your hand. The boy smiled. In the hallway, Whitmore caught up with Eli. They walked toward the stairs side by side. Behind them, the blackboard still held an unfinished equation and, beneath it, one sentence Whitmore had written before leaving. Assumptions are part of the equation.